abandoned and replaced with the plan to disperse and disarm, and had been showing that the version that was first advanced by SABC in the presentation, in the narrative, in your first two statements, and in the evidence of Major General Annandale, was one which consistently suggested that the encirclement plan had been abandoned on the Tuesday in favor of the plan to disperse and disarm. You recall that section of the cross-examination?
I recall the section, yes.
Before you continue, Mr. Jackson, you remember you put to him what Major General Annandale had said, and you suggested that he read the passage in the transcript, get the context and so forth overnight, and then give his answer. I don't know whether this is perhaps appropriate to deal with it first.
Indeed,
unless you want to deal with the other points you made.
Not at all, Chairperson. That was in fact the very next point to which I was going to turn. So Colonel, you'll recall I referred you to a passage from the testimony of Major General Annandale, and in fairness to you, I said you can't really answer, you can't be expected to answer for Major General Annandale, but if you want to look at it overnight and respond in the morning, you should feel free to do so. So this is your opportunity, but in fairness to you, I do want to emphasize that from our perspective, we don't see any obligation on your side to respond for Major General Annandale.
Thank you. And Chairperson, I don't think I can respond to his words. I don't know what his thought patterns were or what he was thinking at the time, whether it was just a misspoken word by him. I don't know. I haven't contacted him either to find out.
What he said was wrong.
In my opinion, yes.
Thank you.
Colonel, you've now had an opportunity to, well, reflect on what we covered yesterday. Can you offer us any explanation for why these four different aspects of the SABC case, the presentation, the narrative, Major General Annandale's testimony, and your own first two statements, all seem to suggest that the encirclement plan was abandoned on the Tuesday?
Thanks. I can try. Obviously, it's all limited to memory recall as well. And I've also been pondering on it at the time that the operation was running. And as I was mentioning, it was a lot of lack of sleep and so on. Lack of sleep and fatigue. And what I've come to appreciate later when putting my consolidated statement together, which was the first time I actually started scouring the documents to try and get a more objective time frame and see what I was saying at the time. This is where I started picking up that, and it was coming back to memory, what was actually happening with regard to my presentations. And I know it may be a repetition, but just to go through it, on the Tuesday, I definitely presented the whole presentation to the formalized JOCOM that afternoon at about 2 o'clock. The Wednesday morning, I only gave the strategic area again, which dealt with the operational deployment side of phase 1. And then obviously reflected there again to the other phases at the time by name. I may have at that stage already given more detail on phase 2, having more time now to have gone into detail on that. But by Thursday, and why I say this is in the mornings, I couldn't actually update the numbers in some of the slides. When it spoke to 56 POPs members need to go to this position and so on, I would be waiting for the roll call to be done to see who was there, to try and fill that in. And then most of that deployment positioning anyway was done by General Annandale, being the superior rank, to be able to tell the superior officers, okay, you will take command there, you will go to this position, etc. So I know that by the Thursday, some of the numbers that I was trying to fill in were not always coinciding with what was being shown. I wasn't in time or fast enough to get everything right by the time I needed to present. And already by the Wednesday, on the coordinating instructions, the times that I had ideally put out in the coordinating instructions were also not being met. Because it would almost be on a stopwatch that you needed to be out here by this time, you needed to be briefing members by that time, we needed you at the front by this time. which is normally the way I would run an operation, and those weren't being met because of the size and the magnitude and the parade that needed to be held, and the JOCOM briefings were going on longer than I'd expected them to, etc. So in upgrading these slides, by the Thursday morning, I got to the place where, and with the experience I was having at that time, as well as these slides were becoming extra information. Most of the people that had seen them by then had seen them, and it was just a repetition. And the emphasis was now more on the actual putting up the deployment, still going over the mission, putting up the deployment to show the commanders where they were expected to be and what they were expected to do, explaining to them their roles. So by Thursday, the best explanation I've got is that some of the slides are still from the Wednesday. I got to sitting in the meeting and changing some of the dates on them and trying to upgrade some of them. But in being incomplete, and I speak under correction, I'm not sure that I presented most of what I was even presenting on the Wednesday, and definitely not what I was presenting on the Tuesday. Come the operational period and time, that evening, after the operation had happened, to the best of my recollection, we knew that there was going to need to be a media briefing by the National Commissioner, and of the opinion as well that part of these briefings and even briefings to her and other senior officers, I would need to give some reflection, whether it be a record of what was actually shown, needed to be made more viewable or than what was there, to try and fix it for the showing to the senior police management and possibly in the briefings thereafter. So I started the Ops Platinum, which is an incomplete document, which is on the Thursday evening. The Friday morning, the decision was taken that the presentation to the media would only comprise of photographs and if there was any video material, which was only of the 13th at that time that we could get our hands on. And that's what went forward. The same presentation.
She also, of course, made a statement herself, the National Commission. Didn't you? On the Friday morning?
Yes.
The National Commission made a statement as well.
Yes.
Are you talking about the presentation that you were presenting after that?
Yeah, the visual presentation.
Okay.
Just going back a bit, though, and I think what maybe interrupted my putting together of the plan on the Thursday afternoon or Thursday early evening was the tasking now to start with the briefing note to the President, which was trying to get as much information together as possible, because I know that I only sent that off officially at about 2 o'clock in the morning. To get back to the National Commissioner's briefing, I'm not sure, I think that happened at about 10, 11 o'clock in the day. I was also mistaken, and I think that my statement speaks to the President's briefing being on the 18th. It was also the 17th, the briefing of the President. So it was almost 2, 3, 4 hours after the National Commissioner's briefing when the President came, gave a press briefing, and we briefed him after that again. In saying that, the briefing he received would be very similar to the one that was given to the media, because I can't recall upgrading the President's briefing other than what was shown to the media that day. Continuing to work on this presentation further, I think after the Commission was announced, the decision was taken that we would need to put together, to assist the Commission with something from the SABC side of a presentation to show what the SAPs, how they experienced it. And this is where the beginnings of, I think the first version is actually even saved as President Zuma. But if you look at the date, it's already on the Monday when I'm working on that. And I've taken parts of the plan from the Thursday when I was busy there, and I've started putting them into this presentation on that Monday now. At the same time, I was also tasked to build a presentation which showed what we were doing post the 16th to maintain the law and order in the area, and that had to accompany the original presentation to the President, which we now gave to an interministerial committee, and I think that was possibly on the Monday. And we had to also brief, I think it was the Provincial Portfolio Committee, also was briefed. And so it went on. But for much of that week, I was kept pretty busy and not able to reflect specifically on the events of the 16th, or specifically recalling JOCOM meetings from the 6 o'clock in the morning, or as much of the wording and so on that I could remember from there. But eventually coming back to the plan and reading my own slides from where I'd put in that this is the meeting of the 16th, it was still reflecting encirclement. And I was, at that stage, convinced by what I still had that it at that time of the morning was encirclement. And this continued pretty much until we got to roots and everybody got to sitting down in their groups and talking. And something there, or someone or something there got to show me, and I say that because I can't recollect specifically a time or a specific event, but I would think it may have been the photographs or the Google printouts of the morning that I handed out, which shows the pre-positioning of the nyalas, that it wasn't encirclement. Because the prelude to a phase 3 was already structured in part of the planning of a phase 2, which meant that I was now off with encirclement when it had to have been a dispersion action already. I'd forgotten about the meeting on the Wednesday at this stage. That was only, as I say, triggered later this year when I was actually at the offices here and somebody mentioned the cattle, and that brought back a flood of memories. The cattle in the environment, which actually brought back the flood of memories. And I still for a moment thought, but that could have been on the Thursday. But then it was, again, a little bit later clarified that, but Brigadier Engelbrecht was also part of that, and he wasn't there at that time, so it has to have been on the Wednesday. Because there was that slight conflict for me about exactly where, due to a lack of memory, where to position these things, although now I could recall that had taken place. It was just about where to sequence them. But the objective evidence to me was the handouts that I'd given out on the Thursday morning to the commanders, showing phase 2.
What time did you give them out?
At 8:30 in the morning, Chairperson. And I also, something that also comes back to memory is that it's possible that both tactical options were still on the cards. That we hadn't totally discarded encirclement, because encirclement could possibly still be used as an early morning, but that dispersion was definitely brought in for a larger grouping. So I don't know if that may help explain certain issues, but I recall in writing my first statement as well that I'd actually mentioned in phase 3 we had 2 options, because when you develop options or tactical options in a plan, you develop always more than one. You consider as many as you can and then choose the feasible one to continue with. And when I initially wrote my statement, I put 2 in, but then in shortening the statement in a sense, I took the opinion of just writing what had actually happened. I didn't think that the
Colonel, I'm really sorry to interrupt you. It's just been communicated to me that our power is about to blow and we need to take a short break.
We'll now adjourn and return after the power blows over. The commission resumes. I understand the power did blow just after we adjourned, but it's been restored, and so we can carry on with your evidence. You were in the middle of an explanation about the problems you had, as I understand it, in reconstructing what had happened over the relevant period. You were explaining the various things that you had to do in the period immediately thereafter, which also delayed the process of reconstruction, if that's an accurate summary of what you were telling us. Can you remember more or less the point you'd reached? Would you like to carry, is there something further you wish to say in that regard?
I've actually lost the point where I was at. I know it was in the second week of the Marikana.
Yes, in the second week, you explained how, in the second week, you said there were various duties in relation to the preservation of law and order at that time, to which you had to give attention. And so you, after some delay, really, finally able to sit down to start reconstructing fully what had happened at the relevant period. And then you also told us about how you were involved in briefing the President and also the Interministerial Committee. But those are more or less the points that you were making. Those who later read the transcript will see that there was probably something really important you said just before the power failed, which I've forgotten. But anyway, anything you want to add? I think the general thrust of what you were telling us is clear. And perhaps if you think of anything later that's relevant, you can add it.
Chairperson, I was just checking the, I think it's the finalized presentation at the end of Roots, which is Complete Marikana 2012-08-03 is what stands as the heading, although I think it is saved only at the end of Roots. And I was just going through that to have a look, because certain points I raised yesterday that the plan initially was spread out and then brought back to a certain day. The parts of the plan that were spread out were simply those Google Earth pictures. They were spread out over the 3 days. But the part of the plan that speaks to phase 1, 2, and 3 came along from the beginning as a slide before days were even put out. And that was one slide which eventually became expanded into more when these pictures were all taken back to the Tuesday. So there was no malicious intent to present that. And I see that in the document at the end of Roots, it does state there, and I'll quote it off the document itself. And I've just opened this now in the break to have a look.
Chairperson, possibly if I can assist here, the document to which Colonel Scott's referring is going to be an exhibit. We've provisionally given it the number JJ155. JJ155. It's the PowerPoint.
Has it been put in yet?
It has been put in. I don't have a page reference for it at this stage. It will be in one of the later files. I can get the.
Has it been referred to yet in the course of the year?
Hasn't been referred to.
So shall we, just for the sake of good housekeeping, record it as an exhibit now?
Indeed, Chairperson.
JJ155, and how does one describe it?
The PowerPoint presentation entitled Complete Marikana. Complete Marikana 2012-08-03.
How can that be right?
I think that 08 is supposed to be an 09.
It sounds like it, unless it was an 010, unless it was a 10.
No, I think it must read 0903. Should be, because that was the
obviously,
time of Bruce.
you would have required crystal ball qualities in order to prepare the presentation on the 3rd of August, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
So that didn't happen. Right. So that's the document you referred.
That's the document. Chairperson, there's a slide in there, slide 64, which says operational overview, and that slide has stage 1, 2, and 3. That same slide comes from not during the operation at Marikana, but when the presentation started its genesis.
Colonel, I'm sorry to interrupt again. I gave it the exhibit number prematurely. My version of this file, which is JJ155, seems to be a version that was saved at a different time with different slide numbering. So
I wonder whether it's necessary for us to go into this now. You've given a long answer. I haven't stopped you because I understand it's important for you and probably ultimately for us. The question of the accuracy of your memory should be looked at, why things But I think you've given us a fairly long account of that. It may well be appropriate to return to it if you wish later anyway, but it's maybe re-examination. But I think, if I speak for myself only, it might be appropriate to move to other matters. And then later on, when all the documents are in, and the whole picture is before us, perhaps you can come back to it if it's necessary. But perhaps you can just clarify what it is that you're referring to, as opposed to the document that Shaskerson thinks you're referring to, just to get that pinned down, as it were, now, and then we'll move on. If you agree with that.
Yes, Chairperson. It was just the stage 3 there. It reads stage 3 tactical option of encircle, dialogue to disarm, or a second sub-bullet, disperse into smaller groups, encircle and disarm. It's reflecting both of the tactical options in that slideshow.
May I just seek clarity about something, please? In your statement, you testified to this as well in 8.22 about a conversation you have with General Annandale. I just need to know exactly when this took place, please. 8.22 of your statement, it's on page 63 of Triple H20. You say there, when Major General Annandale and I started discussing phase 3, the angle of encircling the strikers while they were a large group and aware of the police presence was quickly discounted, and you give a whole lot of reasons for that. When did that conversation take place?
Ma'am, to the best of my recollection, it was on the Wednesday, sometime after the JOCOM, and I tend to think it was still in the morning period of the Wednesday.
But regardless of that discussion, is the word encirclement is still carried over into other documents after that discussion?
Yes. What I was trying to explain earlier was
yes.
The JOCOM of the 15th still had encirclement as the tactical option. Going to the 16th, I was still trying to work on those slides. I don't know if I got to completing those slides, but it still reflected encirclement on the 16th because of coming from the JOCOM of the 15th.
I take it the two of you, General Annandale and you, didn't have the power yourselves to change the plan. That
no.
The change could only be made by the JOCOM, is that right?
That's correct.
And that could only have been on the 16th.
That's correct.
Theoretically, even if you had come up with a complete plan involved in abandonment of the encirclement and replacement by something else, even if you had done that on the Wednesday, theoretically the JOCOM might have said, we don't agree. We think that new plan of yours is inherently risky, and we think that the encirclement one, if done the way we've seen it so far, is less risky. So they might theoretically have done that. Whether they would have done that is pure speculation, but that's a possibility, I take it. Is that right?
That's correct, Chairperson. Yeah. I think that explains why we didn't go into the detail of the new proposed phase 3, but just the strategic idea of an alternative option was considered. If we couldn't encircle, what would we do? And then disperse them rather into smaller groups, and then try to encircle smaller, more manageable groups for that matter. And that strategy, best of my recollection now, is birthed on the Wednesday.
Only in private discussion between you and General Annandale?
It was in the JOCOM, but it wasn't a formalized meeting. I think the
decision was taken on it?
No.
So in that same statement at 8.24 at page 65, when you speak of the alternate suggestion of dispersal into smaller groups, disorganized groups, is that part of the same conversation with Major General Annandale?
I think it is, Commissioner. I'm trying to remember, but I know that I would have been sparked into considering having the points being highlighted that an encirclement of the larger group is not going to be feasible. Obviously, the strategizing, I would being there as a strategic planning officer, would need to start coming up with something. I don't remember if this was expressly discussed with him or if it was something that I sat back and did on my own first and then took to him. But it was definitely, if I look at how we briefed the phase 2 for the Thursday morning, it had already then been discussed for that matter.
Yes, thank you.
The section to which my colleague has referred you in your statement, triple H20, the passage just referred you, is introduced essentially by paragraph 8.22, where you talk about the discussion that you had with General Annandale. And the points raised were, and then you set the points out in sub-paragraphs, and then the statement continues, essentially elaborating on what appears in the various sub-paragraphs 8.22. So it does appear as if you're only talking about a discussion with General Annandale, as I read it. If I'm wrong, you must correct me.
Well, I remember the discussion being predominantly between the two of us, Chairperson, but I know it was in the JOC, which means, and the JOC was never empty where it was only the two of us there. There would have been other permanent JOC role players sitting around the table. But I do recall it being an informal meeting. It wasn't something sat down and spoken to. Brigadier Engelbrecht does refer to what seems to be a little bit more of a formalized meeting when we reviewed the actual phase 3, where I gave a presentation on that. But he doesn't speak to the points afterwards, which were definitely General Annandale, myself. I can only remember the two of us sort of brainstorming against each other, coming up with why this then couldn't work. I don't remember any other inputs though, or from other people.
But there was consensus reached between you and Major Annandale, Major General Annandale at that stage as to how you would progress with the matter the following day.
I think that I can say that the consensus was reached that an encircling of that larger crowd, and this is why I alluded yesterday to the picture which showed the razor wire being positioned against the power station was I can think was still looked at to see whether that could be feasible. Did we have enough razor wire? But I really can't remember the rationale around that. But it was definitely then seen that encircling that larger group is not going to be feasible.
You do speak to that in paragraph 8.26 on page 67. Is that your recollection of how it was resolved at that meeting, or during that discussion?
That's 8.27 or 8.26.
8.26 going over the page.
I see what I've said there, and this is in, again, the best of my recollection, that I don't think we would have left the point hanging. I think while during those discussions we would have actually said, well, what are the alternative then? But what I do pertinently recall is that there wasn't detail at all put to that new strategy. It remained basically a sentence of, this is the next option that we must look at.
Thank you.
Colonel, it's
Sorry, before you carry on, Mr. Schass, one question I'd like to ask you before he proceeds. It follows on a question that my colleague, Advocate Hemworth, put you. It's 8.23 of your statement, the footer page 64, where you make the point, I take it you still adhere to, that for many good reasons the encirclement could only be feasible for an early morning deployment, where a small number of less than 50 strikers were on the copy. So encirclement, as planned, was only a viable option early in the morning, first light basically, even possibly before sunrise.
Chairperson, that's correct, as it was envisioned for the Tuesday morning initial.
Yeah, no, but you're now talking, as I understand it, in 8.23 about...
Yes, as I mean, if it was, we couldn't do it Tuesday. I envisioned it possible for Wednesday.
You couldn't do it for Wednesday, then subject to what you're now telling us, it would hold over until Thursday. And according to what you say, there was no formal decision of the JOC to abandon that idea.
Yes.
Before Thursday morning. Thursday morning you had a problem because there was still the possibility, although the intelligence people didn't believe it, that the arms could be laid down,
yes.
put down. So if the encirclement was going to be proceeded with, it could only be done on Friday.
Yes.
That's right. Whether it was still feasible on Friday is a matter that you assume it will be questioned about.
Yes.
But that's the position, is it not?
Yes.
Colonel, 45 minutes down the line, I have to say I think we've been a little at cross purposes, at least you and I, because the exchanges have been very helpful, but they've really gone to a question which is a different question from the question I was interested in. The exchanges that have gone, that have taken place have gone to the question of when the encirclement plan was abandoned. Was it Wednesday afternoon, Thursday morning, or was it still on the table at the JOC, coming out of the JOC on the Thursday morning and abandoned later? And in that context, you were, I think, explaining why some of the documents that you produced after the event suggested that the abandonment took place later on the Thursday. My question was, in fact, a slightly different question. My question related to the fact that, as between us now, it's common cause that the plan wasn't abandoned on the Tuesday, wasn't abandoned on the Wednesday morning either, and was at least on the table until the JOCCOM meeting at 6 o'clock on the Thursday. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And yet, if we go to 4 different elements of the SAP's version that were presented earlier, they all suggest that the plan was abandoned on the Tuesday. And I was asking you to explain why that would be the case. Why would 4 different aspects of the SAP's version, the presentation, the narrative, your first 2 statements, Major General Annandale's evidence, why would they all suggest that the plan was abandoned on the Tuesday when we know now that that's not the case? It was a plan, it was at best abandoned on the morning of the 16th at the Thursday 16th 6 a.m. JOC meeting. So why the different version from SAP's to begin with?
I think that what you're saying in abandoned, I can't speak for General Annandale in the comments that he made, but what we were trying to convey in the presentation and in my statements was simply that that was the stages as they were for the operation. We didn't see the importance, or we didn't see at that time that it was important to mention something that we didn't do or continue with. That's the best I can answer to it. It was never looked at in the depth that you're looking at it now, that it could be a controversial issue. So, as I say, we tried to work on what we did do and what we did want to have in place on the Thursday, for that matter, although it's mentioned on the Tuesday. And as I said yesterday, and as I was explaining a moment ago, that the slides which deal with the planning, barring the Google pictures which were initially put onto each of the days, the Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, were brought back to the Tuesday because it was felt that in the presentation, and possibly speaking for the narrative too, it would be difficult to have a plan which was segmented over the days, and it wouldn't give the reader or the audience the continuity of what the stages were, having to deal with a lot of information between the deployment as such.
In fact, what is in the presentation then is inaccurate. Is it not? I mean, it creates an impression that this was the position.
I understand that, Chairperson, yes.
So surely inaccuracy can't be preferred to something which the reader will have difficulty in following, but will ultimately, presumably, with guidance, be able to follow. I mean, that must be so, Sean. Or am I overstating?
Chairperson, as I say, there was no malicious intent.
No.
I'm
I'm not suggesting malice.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, effectively, what you seem to be saying, I don't think you thought it out properly, that really an inaccurate statement you seem to be suggesting is better than a statement which is more difficult to understand.
Yes.
You don't mean that, you?
No.
Well, Colonel, in your explanation, you said that something along the lines that it was never anticipated that this would be controversial. I think the word you used was controversial. But I must put to you that SABC must have anticipated that this would be an important issue before the Commission, because SABC implemented a plan on the 16th. Things went horribly wrong for whatever reason, and 34 people ended up dead. Now, one of the things that SABC must have known that they would have to explain at this Commission is that the death of 34 people was not caused by a plan that had been put together without sufficient care. That much you must have known. Would you accept that?
Yes.
And you were the primary planner, so that must have weighed quite heavily with you in particular.
Well, I didn't see it the way you're seeing it, because if what you're saying, why would I have given all my evidence, all my PowerPoint presentations which speak to encirclement, etc., over if this was the case?
Colonel, I must accept that you of all the people in SABC have played open cards with us and have given us access to contemporaneous documents that we hadn't received through the official SABC channels, and I must place on record our gratitude for that. But dealing with the version that was put up before we got to see those documents. And you and SABC must have known that you were going to have to show to this Commission that the plan that was ultimately implemented was one that had been designed with all of the care required of a reasonable police force dealing with the situation with which you were confronted at Marikana. Will you accept that?
I think that the view I had, and I can only speak for myself, not for others, was that although the plan was created and there was the stages that were there and the strategy to me was sound, the fact that it never got to roll out the way it was envisioned to roll out was, to me, and unless it's proven otherwise, still my belief that there was an intention from those strikers to confront the police with aggression. So there was never, and that was my point of view from what I'd seen and from the evidence I was shown. And so, as I say, there was no, the planning as itself never got to roll out. I never had a reason to, I believe that if the plan had its chance to have been effectively rolled out the way that it was envisioned to roll out, there would have possibly been far fewer injuries, for that matter, or incidents that would have occurred.
Well, Colonel, that's a completely different chapter of this cross-examination, which we're unlikely to reach before we break today, but we will have to discuss that. But my present concern is something slightly different. It's you and SABC must have realized that you were going to have to show this Commission that you put all of the appropriate care into the plan, into designing the plan that was ultimately implemented. Would you accept that much?
Well, what I can accept is, and as I say, the time was a limiting factor. So if one takes this and thrashes it out as if we've had a year to do now, it's not, or the saying goes 20/20 hindsight now. At the time, and what we knew at the time, the limited things we knew at the time, the limited time we had to prepare what we did, I feel we did as best as we could. And what we've put onto paper thereafter is only what we could have done, and that's the reflection of what we have done. So to try and make it look better than what we have is just not what was there at the time.
Well, you said a short while earlier you can only speak for yourself, you can't speak for SABC, but we can see what the SAP's position was, broader than your own, from the opening statement. And paragraph 25 of the opening statement puts the SAP's case in these terms. You'll hear of the fluidity of the situation at Marikana on Thursday, 16 August 2012, a situation that got out of control and tragic unintended consequences resulted. And this is the passage I would emphasize. Despite meticulous scenario planning by experienced generals and other officers at the Joint Operational Center to achieve the object of dispersing and disarming over 3,000 protesters. Now, you also said that time is the limiting factor. And that's why this shift in the version from an original version which we now know wasn't true, wasn't correct, that the dispersal and disarm plan had been put on the table on Tuesday and was there from Tuesday through Wednesday to Thursday when it was ultimately implemented. From that version to the current version, which is it was only first adopted in principle by the JOC at 6 in the morning, seems to me quite an important shift. Because if it had been there for 2 days, it starts looking much more like a plan that was the subject of meticulous scenario planning by generals in the JOC. In fact, it wasn't there for 2 days. Let's look at what your version says about it now. It originated in discussions at the JOC on Wednesday. But that wasn't anything meticulous because you make clear in your statement that the detail of phase 3 as to how the action would take place was not discussed. That's page 67, para 8.26. And you've reconfirmed that today. And in fact, in answer to the chairperson, you candidly said if there was going to be a change of strategy, it would be the JOCCOM that would have to adopt that formally. And in advance of any formal adoption by the JOCCOM, you wouldn't go into detail because until the JOCCOM had formally adopted there wasn't a strategy to flesh out in detail. Is that a fair?
I wouldn't say that I wouldn't go into detail. As I say, that I think the thought processes for me were triggered already then. But it wasn't an open point discussion to consult with others on.
I think your words were it was only an outline of the strategic option. There wasn't any detail at all. I think that was in response to Commissioner Hemraj.
Yes.
So there wasn't any detail on the Wednesday. We then get to the 6 a.m. JOCCOM on the Thursday. And you discuss that at page 74, paragraph 9.4 of your statement. And you say, when I was asked to show the deployment, I briefed the commanders by showing the mission and strategic guidelines and then speaking directly to the Google Earth satellite photo with icons arranged on it. In explaining phase 2, I mentioned the outline of phase 3, as phase 2 was in essence also a pre-positioning in case phase 3 was to be implemented. So again, you're not providing any detail of phase 3 in the morning.
Yeah, that's correct.
And there's certainly not going to be any detailed debate within the JOCCOM at the formal JOCCOM meeting of the details of phase 3 in the morning.
No, but I think one must also understand that some of the principles mentioned, if you say to the POPs commanders dispersal, there's a whole host of prerequisites to a dispersal which they immediately understand. If you talk about a defensive line of razor wire, they understand what that is too, to isolate or a specific area or target or to cordon off an area. So, but it's true what you're saying, that it wasn't discussed in detail. I'm just mentioning that when you do speak to commanders, they have the techniques, the tactics and the procedures already embedded through their training. It's not necessary always then to flash out or to flush the actual detail with them.
I'm not going to take issue with you on that, but the first point at which detail emerges in the JOCCOM is at the 1:30 JOCCOM. Is
Yes.
that correct? And that you describe at page 80, paragraphs 12.4 and 12.5 of your statement. And if I can just get that passage. Maybe it's better to start the previous page on page 79 to contextualize it, paragraph 12.3. The question was asked by Major General Annandale to the JOCCOM representatives at the outset how we were going to execute Phase 3. So at that stage, how Phase 3 was going to be executed was still something that had to be debated.
The detail, yes.
To my understanding, clarity was sought on the actual application of the strategy with regards to the implementation, which had not been discussed to that point.
Yes.
So you had a dispersal and disarm strategy, but detail hadn't entered the picture in the JOCCOM.
That's right.
I asked if I may suggest a course of action to which I was given the floor to brief the JOCCOM. I explained on the Google Earth satellite photo which I'd printed out for the commanders that morning for the Phase 2 deployment where I felt the dispersion should take place, with the different units in their different roles and areas of responsibility. On conclusion, Major General Annandale requested any further inputs and whether the concept was acceptable. So even at that stage, the concept was up for debate.
Yes.
There were no objections to the operational concept, so the concept was accepted. Were there any further inputs in relation to the detail that you'd suggested?
No, and I think maybe we're misunderstanding the operational concept, but the concept, there's the strategy. The strategy was to disperse smaller groups, disarm, etc. The concept is now speaking to how we're going to do it in broad terms. In other words, the direction to where we would want them to go, a stop and reorganize line, how the teams would be lined up and formed up. That's speaking to the concept here. So there was no objection to that concept, it's not down to the lower level detail. There was more detail given at the actual forward holding area 2 briefing, which was more at a tactical level than it was at this level.
Okay. Can we just go to Exhibit EE, which are the minutes of the 1:30 JOCCOM? And I'd like you to look at that attendance list. I don't see any POPs officers there.
No, they were deployed in the field.
Okay, so the first time that any detail is given to the plan is at the 1:30 meeting where an order to implement the plan is given and where there are no POPs officers present to inform what the plan is going to look like.
There are no current serving POPs officers there, but we have people like Brigadier Tsolowane, who was, I think, spent much of his career in a public order policing unit, and if not mistaken, was a commander, I think, at the Velcom unit, for that matter as well. And being an NIU member, his members are called around South Africa to help re-establish order where there's been public violence and unrest.
You've got one ex-POP member there.
That's the only one to my knowledge, Chairperson.
What we see in 12.5 is, on conclusion, Major General Annandale requested any further inputs and whether the concept was acceptable. There were no objections to the operational concept. That's, I think, correct.
That's correct.
There was no current POP member there to make inputs.
No.
There was no current POP person there to raise an objection.
No.
There's only one person who was an ex-POP member. Is that right?
That's right.
I see.
And the detail that you're giving, the detail that's given at the meeting seems to come primarily, if not exclusively, from you. Is there any detail that comes from anybody else at the meeting?
No.
And you've already confirmed that you had no knowledge of Standing Order 262, which was the SAP Standing Order dealing with public order policing.
I had no knowledge of that specific standing order. As I say, I had successfully completed a course before that standing order was implemented. I think it was implemented in about 2003-04. I'd done my course in somewhere around 2001-02, which dealt predominantly with the public order policing arena, based on what happened at the Ellis Park tragedy. So the training was embedded through that, as well as the tactical options of POPs, what they stand for, because we had to plan those into scenarios during that course. So to say that I had no knowledge of the specific, as you say, Standing Order 262, but what's embedded in 262 is not newly thought out. It comes with a long process. So it would be incorrect to simply just say that what's inside there, because one thing that struck me when we did have a meeting to look at Standing Order 262 and how it compared to how we planned, it very much, and if we do that, you'll find very much of the principles in the plan are reflected in Standing Order 262, although I was not aware of 262's contents, but simply the principles of policing and the previous training I had ensured that those principles were still met.
We will have that debate at a later stage when we come to look more closely at the plan itself. For now, I want to look at how the plan was designed. The next stage in the process is the briefing to the commanders in the field. Major General Annandale instructs you to go out into the field to brief the commanders. Now, these are the people who are going to have to implement the plan.
Yes.
And this is the very first briefing that they will receive on how this new Phase 3 is going to be implemented.
It's the very first detailed briefing where it's actually told to them the concept, as I mentioned earlier, the more detailed version of what was meant earlier when said dispersion into smaller teams, in smaller groups.
Well, what was said earlier? What briefing, without detail, had they received at 6 a.m. at the JOC?
Well, I'm going to need to speak now from a deductive logic, but in explaining...
Colonel, I'd ask you not to speak from deductive logic, and I'd ask you to speak about what you can remember that you actually said to people at 6 a.m. at the JOC. And if I might just explain why. You said to us yesterday, and I've looked at the transcript, when we were discussing when the first plan was abandoned, your words were, and that conversation about the problems with encirclement, your words were...
If you give us a reference in the transcripts when we read it later, read this passage later, we'll understand what you're referring to.
Sorry, Chairperson. It's page 14246, lines 7 to 12. I'm afraid we don't have an electronic version of it available yet. Initially, I thought that happened on Thursday. And for many months, in fact, I thought that was part of the Thursday discussion. And then it was only in this year, later this year, a couple of months back, that, or more recently, I realized it had to have been on the Wednesday. That was your first attempt to date that discussion about the shortcomings of the encirclement plan. And then lower down from line 20, as I say, I also recall that happening on a Thursday, and I was for a long time thought that was actually the Thursday discussion, but it didn't make sense to me because of the fact that when I looked at the photos that I handed out on the 16th in the morning, that the Nyalas were pre-positioned for Phase 3. And then later on page 14251, lines 6 to 8, when I asked you, my question was, Colonel, if I heard you correctly, you said that these discussions about the difficulties of the encirclement tactical option, the cattle, the humanitarian risk, the risk that the protesters might just step outside the encirclement zone, that discussion you thought for many months had taken place on the Thursday. Is that what you said? And then your response was, yeah, it may have been until we got to roots or somewhere around there when it was more put into context about what had happened. So your memory, well, let me go back a step. The decision to move away from the encirclement plan, formally to abandon the encirclement plan, couldn't have taken place before those discussions about cattle and humanitarian risks and so on. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So your memory about an issue as important as when that plan was abandoned was, at least until roots, sufficiently cloudy that you thought that that plan had been abandoned only after an informal discussion in the JOC about cattle and humanitarian risks after a JOCCOM meeting that had happened on the Thursday. Is that correct?
I said that for a long time, looking back at my documents from that time, which shows encirclement still on the Thursday morning as part of the JOCCOM slides, it was only later in this year where something was triggered that actually got my memory. And I'll come back to something in a moment, that actually got me to realize that these were the reasons that we actually abandoned trying to encircle a larger group. Or when we looked at the idea of doing it, it was not feasible. I don't want to say encirclement was abandoned. It could have still been feasible for an early morning. So even after, and with all the taskings I received after the initial Marikana event, coming back to try to recollect, I was re-looking at my own slides, and that was my foundation for what I thought had happened over that time. I mentioned this whole time period felt almost as though there was a day missing for me, as though it wasn't only 3 days, there should have been more. But what brought me back to actually realizing that it was on the Wednesday was only in this year. However, at Roots, I can already see that there are documents there that I've created, where I've gone back to actually realizing at Roots already that dispersion was on the table already from the early morning because of the photographs that were provided. So something wasn't making sense to me, but there was always something niggling that something's out of place. And it was put into place this year when I actually, the cattle issue with the rest of the why we couldn't employ the razor wire, as well as the Brigadier Engelbrecht meeting, as well as the Colonel Marafe meeting, which I also placed on the Thursday for that matter initially.
All that I'm saying in this context is I would caution you in answering, I would ask you in answering to rely on what you actually remember briefing people about, because what the uncertainty around the date reveals is that if you start looking at documents that have been created around the time later and then inferring, you may end up remembering something which has the wrong details in it. I mean, you're saying to us now that for many months you remembered all of this happening on the Thursday, but you now think it happened on the Wednesday.
I think the short answer is that I can't remember much of the 6 o'clock Thursday morning briefing at all. I know that I did give a briefing. I know that it would have been me that gave the briefing of the photographs that you see that were given out to the handouts to the commanders. I know inherently that through my past and how I would have worked on a briefing, I would have always tried to start with a mission because it's something we try to emphasize. That's how I've been trained. So I would have given that. And when speaking to Phase 2, I know I would have spoken to the purpose and the reasoning of the razor wire, why it was there. And then I would have also alluded to the fact that it was there as a prepositioning for a Phase 3. And then, as I say, it's deductive reasoning, but I would have said what Phase 3 is.
With no recollection of this is all reconstruction. Is that right?
Yes.
I'm not putting anything to it. It may be accurate reconstruction, but I just want to identify it is reconstruction.
Yes.
Colonel, just allow me to clarify something, Mr. Chaskerson. Mr. Chaskerson referred you to 12.3. In 12.2 of your statement, you say that the Phase 3 strategy to eliminate the concept of encirclement and adopt the strategy, the hybrid plan to disperse, was clarified in the JOC. Now, what are you referring to there?
That's the meeting with General Annandale.
The informal meeting?
Yes.
And you don't know who else was there?
No, I think there may have been Brigadier Fritz, Brigadier Tilawane. They were permanent JOC members. The crime intelligence personnel I know did move out to work on the crime intelligence issues. And then I think Mr. Dirk Boertes would have been permanently seated there at that time. It's about those.
What do you mean by saying the Phase 3 strategy had already been clarified? I can understand discussions about it. If we abandon the encirclement, we'll have to have something in its place, etc. I can understand all that. But clarified is rather a strong word, isn't it?
I think clarified in the sense that an encirclement of a large group is not going to work, and that, as I say, then just as the strategy, that we need to look at rather dispersing, because dispersing is not just a physical action, it starts with a verbal action, which means that many of these people can then leave knowing that the police are going to carry something out. So when the police generally in terms may speak dispersion, speaking to another policeman that understands dispersion, you understand the whole flow of what's being said behind the word. So in saying clarifying there, he's clarifying that an encirclement of a large group that size is not going to work.
I'll tell you what my problem with that. I don't understand you now. So I understand you. Encirclement of a large group had never been a plan. Encirclement, according to the passage we discussed earlier, had always involved encircling a small group, 50 or less, first light, possibly even before sunrise.
That's
so
correct.
there was never, as I understand, if I'm wrong, you must please correct me, there was never a plan to encircle a large group. And in fact, one just has to think about it, it wouldn't have worked, would it? Encirclement of a large group wasn't on ever, was it?
No.
As a feasible plan. So I don't understand what you're now telling us. Please help me to understand you.
Chairperson, it was looked at whether that encirclement could take place with a large group. The same strategy of trying to encircle, whether that was still feasible for a larger group. And as I say, it was determined not to be so. But before moving to a dispersion strategy, we first took the initial strategy, which was for a first light, had a look at whether there would be sufficient wire, for instance, or what would it take, and all the options about that, and what were the counterproductive aspects to that. And that's how that reasoning process took place, to say, but this, if we tried to take the encirclement concept and include it for a larger group, how would we try to do that, and would it be feasible? And it turned out to be no, it wouldn't be feasible. So what is the option? What is the other option to that?
Colonel, if we can go back to the briefing that the POPs commanders receive in the field at 2:30. It's certainly the first detailed briefing they're going to receive on how the new Phase 3 is to be implemented. And what they'd know from the morning JOCCOM on your version is that the old encirclement plan has been replaced, and there's now a new plan that involves dispersal and disarming.
That's correct.
What more would they have known from the morning JOCCOM meeting in terms of detail?
I think in your words, I don't want to put deductive reasoning in place. So I don't particularly recall the detail of what being said.
Now, when you see them at 1:30, you don't give them anything on paper. 2:30, I beg your pardon. Thank you, Chairperson. You don't give them anything on paper. And the only paper that they were given in the morning were the gridded maps that were handed out to deal with Phase 2.
That's correct.
But those gridded maps no longer describe the situation on the ground, because the movement of Nyala 6 has changed matters significantly.
That's right.
And can we just illustrate that for the commissioners by calling up slides 149 and 50 of Exhibit L? So that's what they got from the morning. That was one. And if we can go to 150. those were the two maps that they had from the morning.
That's correct.
And what they now have to implement is what is described in slide 181. If we can go down to 181. And 181 describes what's going to have to be implemented, but for present purposes, what I'd focus on is it also shows the new configuration of the barbed wire Nyalas now that Nyala 6 has been moved to the east.
Yes.
Now, the movement of Nyala 6 has very serious implications for your plan. Would you accept? Well, let me put them to you. You don't need to accept it boldly. First of all, it has implications for your positive and negative attraction points. If we go back to slide 150. Can we go back to slide 150? Now, the negative attraction point is in Kaneng, which is marked in red there as Greater Squatter Camp. Is that correct?
That is one of the lesser. The initial is the Vonnekorp hostels, the NUM offices and so on behind the police lines to the direct east.
But in Kaneng is certainly a negative attraction point.
It is also for us, yes.
And it's a negative attraction point of some significance because quite apart from the fact that you want to keep the strikers out of Nkaneng, it's also where they're most likely to go to because that's where a lot of them live.
Well, you're calling the strikers now as one group, and yeah, a lot of them. Well, it was picked up that a lot of them had walked out, those specifically that were not in the militant group, for that matter. I'm not sure where the militant group came from, but the coming and goings of a lot of people from Nkaneng settlement, yes, walked from there to the Kopi.
On the morning, that negative attraction point is covered quite nicely by the barbed wire line. If you look at that barbed wire line, it screens the entire access route to Nkaneng, and it is designed to funnel protesters to the west, which is your positive attraction point.
That's correct.
If we can cut back to 181, now if you look at where the barbed wire line is going to go, Nkaneng has been exposed.
It's been exposed because the razor wire line now is a protection wire for all assets inside what we call the police safe zone. There's still a line of police officials, as you can see, with the vehicles and the red and green depicting TRT, NIU, SDF. Remembering again that once that razor wire line has been deployed and the police move out to form up, there's first going to be a verbal command given or warning given of an impending tactical action of dispersing, which means that whoever wanted to leave was going to leave, and those that wanted to leave were going to be permitted to leave. So they would have been able to walk either past or even through the police line, for that matter, those that wanted to leave. And the rationale behind that was this is why we had a phase 6, so that once what had been cleared up around the Kopi area, it was envisioned that after this, that evening, the public order policing and TRT and necessary groupings were going to go to the hostels to go and do cordon and searches there to remove the arms of those who had possibly walked away from the Kopi itself because of the verbal impending warning.
Wasn't the informal settlement also included in the area covered by the cordon and search authorization issued by the Provincial Commissioner?
Yes, it was, Chairperson, but it was a bit optimistic to I think that would have taken a lot more personnel to have to cover that. It would have been a literal house-to-house, and in my opinion, been very dangerous for that matter for the police members involved.
But you will agree that the new configuration of the barbed wire creates a new dimension, that until you can get your police armored vehicles out around the barbed wire into the position that we see at slide 181, Nkaneng is exposed.
It is.
And if we go down to slide 193, which is just at the start of the operation, we see that you illustrate, it's the start of the operation, Nyala 1 has moved out its barbed wire to Nyala 2. You see that some of the protesters are, if I can just identify, there's Nyala 1, I'm marking Nyala 1 for record purposes, it's the Nyala just above the long red arrow with a dotted line behind it. You have marked on this slide, protester organized group remain with others on the koppies while a number of protesters are departing. And the protesters who are departing to Nkaneng along this line of the white arrow that I am flagging with my laser pointer.
That is so, but if you look carefully, there are other protesters walking along the road to the north as well. I'm just highlighting with that white arrow that there are some already leaving.
But what you've highlighted with the white arrow is that there are protesters moving to Nkaneng,
Yes.
and it's a feature of the new configuration that it's possible to move to Nkaneng.
Well, even if the old configuration was still in place, they would still have been able to move to Nkaneng as long as the razor wire wasn't deployed.
Well, even with the razor wire deployed, they can move to Nkaneng in this configuration, because if you look at Nyala 6, over there,
Yes, I don't dispute that.
the razor wire is going to run from 5 to 6, and the route to Nkaneng, this main path, which is picked up by the white arrow, is in fact outside the razor wire line.
I see that, yes.
The plan appears to have been to block off that main route before Nyala 6 was moved.
Chairperson, I think the initial, the concept behind the plan was, as I say, to bring out, to give a warning, to allow those that want to leave to move off, and that simply to prevent violent or aggressive emotional strikers from running into the Nkaneng settlement. Thus, the police's action to move towards the south and sweep towards the west, so we could push anyone that was emotional, violent, or wanting confrontation away from areas where there would be innocent people.
Sorry, don't understand you to be disagreeing with me. You're actually agreeing with me, but giving the reasoning why.
Yes.
Yeah.
And we know that in due course, when the militant protesters did decide to move, the direction in which they moved was towards Nkaneng.
Well, that's debatable. The direction they could have moved was towards the police line. So I'm not going to agree to the fact that they were trying to go to Nkaneng.
Well, objectively, the direction in which they moved was the direction of Nkaneng. It was to the east.
They weren't necessarily intending to go to Nkaneng. They may have been intending to implement threats that had allegedly been made earlier to attack the police.
Well, can we agree that they moved east?
Yes, they moved east.
And that the difference in the barbed wire configuration once Nyala 6 had been moved is that it was possible to move east without being screened out by the barbed wire.
Yes, it would be.
So to get back to where all of this started, the paper that the commanders on the ground have describes a configuration that has changed materially between 6 o'clock and 1:30. You'll accept that much?
The only vehicle that's changed is Nyala 6. So if we look at what's displayed in the slide now, you can see that the interpretation even of what I'd presented on the slide is slightly different to their initial operational deployments on ground. But from what I can see, from their first deployment to this deployment, the only Nyala that has moved has been Nyala 6.
But that movement has significant implications for the plan.
Yes.
Now, you don't brief them with any new paper. You brief them by showing the plan on your laptop in the back of a Mercedes Vito.
That's correct.
Can you just describe the situation a bit more clearly to us? Where were you sitting?
I sat just inside the seat so that I was under the roof, so that there was a little bit of darkness for the computer screen so that people could see it better, with the audience standing just outside the Vito.
And does the Vito have a sliding door that opens on the side?
That's correct.
So you're sitting inside the Vito with the sliding door open on the side. The Vito's parked in the open air.
Yes.
And you've gone inside to get some shade so that your screen is visible.
Yes.
And are you sitting with the laptop facing you or facing the people outside?
It's facing the people outside. I'm sitting to the side of it with them. I can actually clearly remember that the Vito was facing towards the east, the open door was towards the south, and the people that were standing to the south of the Vito, with me sitting just inside the Vito with my laptop and explaining to them on the laptop screen.
How many people were receiving this explanation?
I can't give the exact amount, but there were a number of probably 10, 15.
I just want to go to your statement, because I seem to remember a number of 20, but
yes, it does say there were about 20 persons at the briefing.
So you've got 20 people who are being briefed on the basis of an image on a laptop by you sitting inside a Mercedes Vito. And that is the sum total of the visual aid to the presentation. There's no writing, there's just what they can make out on the screen with your instruction.
It's right what you're saying, but I have a problem with how you're putting it. You're making it, or trying to make it sound as though there are people that are standing that can visually not see, or I'm somewhere deep inside a Vito and maybe only 4 or 5 can see the screen, which is not the case.
We may have to have an inspection in loco with a Vito.
Yes.
But it does seem to me that the possibility of some of the 20 not seeing the screen seems to be quite a high possibility in those circumstances, or not being able to make out what is being depicted on the screen.
No, I can't speak to that. I can't agree with you on that either.
I take it your point would be that if someone couldn't see and wanted to know what was being shown, he could have raised his hand and said, please give me a chance to see it as well. And that didn't happen, I take it. Is that right?
Yes, Chairperson.
Now, according to your statement, your briefing lasts approximately 45 minutes. You say it started at 2:30 sharp, and you got back to the jock at 15:15.
No, there's travel time involved on the return, so it was about at most a half an hour.
After that briefing, the commanders have to go and brief their troops. Do you know how much time was left for them to do that?
Well, I would have left at about 1500, give or take a couple of minutes, so they would have gone back. That would have given them, counting travel time in, again about 20 minutes, until the half-past time that they would have had to brief their troops, about 20 minutes.
Well, past was when the operation had to begin.
Yeah.
So presumably the briefing would have to end sometime before operation commenced, because
we're in hypothetical areas now, because I can't speak for how long those briefings took place. I'm not sure if they went on beyond. I know that it was scheduled to begin at 15:30. We know it didn't. Whether the briefings were even concluded by 15:30, I can't say.
Colonel, if we can then just recap the details. Recap. We're talking about a plan now, the details of which were designed on the day of the 16th.
Yes.
By yourself.
Yes.
And from what we can work out, without material input from anybody else. Is that correct?
Pretty much, yes.
And in particular, without input from commanders with crowd management expertise?
No, but they did have the opportunity, even whilst I was briefing them in forward holding Area 1, to have given inputs for that matter.
Well, let's interrogate that. The decision had already been taken to implement the plan at that stage.
To implement dispersion with, as we know, the strategy and the concept of moving them off towards the west, smaller groups, encircle them as smaller groups, isolate and arrest, disarm and arrest, yes.
You had an operation that was going to commence at 15:30.
It was supposed to commence at 15:30, yes.
You arrived for this briefing at 14:30.
14:30.
You had to explain the briefing to people.
I had to explain it to them.
You had to leave them with enough time to get back to their troops to communicate it to their troops.
That's correct.
What realistic opportunity was there for them within that context to make any material changes to your details?
Well, this is something they need to be questioned or asked. If they at that stage felt that there was something untoward, they could have brought it up. And again, with them being the operational experts on ground, it would have been left to them. Remembering that speaking at the operational level, they are going to execute it at the tactical level on ground. So this is why when you talk to those commanders and you say, we want you to deploy the razor wire and close it, as it was mentioned earlier at the 6 o'clock meeting, that would be something to form a barrier line between the police, for that matter, the negative and positive, or negative attraction points, and to where the strikers were seated. There's not much more in detail that you need to explain to them on that, other than what I've mentioned in my statement. When you say to the dispersion line that you need to come out and disperse in this direction, you don't explain dispersion to public order policing members. They understand dispersion through their training. So it's a matter of where do you want me and how do you want me to disperse in what direction. And that's what actually occurs there. There were slight amendments to that plan, because what I did explain to them was start with water cannons, when necessarily water cannons wouldn't be the first way of starting a physical dispersion. And I'm talking outside of the actual pre-warning phase, because I was trying not to have police members close to strikers. I was trying to keep a gap between them so that there would not be conflict, for that matter. So those were the small changes made, for instance, in that force continuum, which is not a major if you consider that the water is simply water and used to disperse people. It's a non-lethal means. So that type of small tweaking was what was mentioned there. And then one or two small suggestions given to them. As I say, the second water cannon had arrived, which I initially wasn't aware of, and when it had arrived, I suggested placing it in the police safe area to assist with the dispersion from that side and also helping to protect the razor wire line. So I was giving small suggestions on tactical advice. But again, this is all subject to the operational commanders, who many of which were higher in rank than me and more experienced in the public order domain. So they would have heard the dispersion strategy and concept and then gone out to operationalize it themselves in the tactical arena of the environment they're working in.
Well, Colonel, I do want to put to you that the facts of what we now agree happened in relation to the design and detailed description of this plan do present a picture that is quite a far cry from the meticulous scenario planning that SAPS conveyed to us in its opening statement. A meticulous scenario planning that involved experienced generals and other senior officers at the job. What's your response to that?
I'm not sure how I can respond. I've given you my version of my experiences while I was there.
Well, in relation to this particular plan, what meticulous scenario planning took place involving senior generals and other senior officers at the job?
Well, the best I can explain it is that when I'm explaining to them strategies and presenting possible solutions to them, they're sitting absorbing what I'm saying, and if there are going to be inputs or if there are going to be any changes, that's where it would be done. So the fact of the matter was that the generals were involved in that sense. They were briefed, they were made aware, as were most of the commanders that were there, if not all the commanders, at least in the morning JOCOMs. So I can't speak beyond that.
But in terms of the detail of this plan, which emerged for the first time at 1330, the role of the generals was at best passive. It was listening to what you had to say and identifying whether there were any flaws that they wanted to, flaws or additions that they wanted to add, and deciding that there weren't.
Yes.
And this whole line of cross-examination started with the strange anomaly that the SAPS cases we first sought suggested very strongly that the plan that was ultimately implemented was a plan that had really been on the table for more than 2 days inside the JOC, which wasn't the case.
No, I've mentioned that it was never meant to be taken that way. It was just of that period, Operation Marikana, over 3 days. This was the strategy that was used.
Well, Colonel, I want to shift to a different issue now, but it may be a convenient time to take
it. Stage to take the tea, German. I think we're moving to another area, another aspect. We're expecting a visit from someone from the department who we'll be meeting over tea adjournment, so we may take a bit longer in coming back than usual the case. But we'll take the adjournment for tea and we'll come back as soon as we can after 11:15.